This morning, Gavin shared with me during the mission trip this week that he spent the week working with senior adults. And he met a man who used to be a truck driver. And he said he could drive from Florida to California in less than a week. The first time a group of Americans traveled all the way across the western United States was in 1804, the Lewis and Clark expedition. And it took them over 2 years. But they had a plan. Lewis and Clark had a plan. They would follow the Missouri River all the way up to its source to the Continental Divide. And then they would cross over the Continental Divide and find a river and canoe down the other side to the Pacific Ocean. Well, they reached the Continental Divide, only they didn't find a river. What they found was the Rocky Mountains. It was sort of bad news and good news. The bad news was there was no river, but the good news was they weren't going to need those canoes. It's good to have plans. Planning is very important, but our plans don't always work out. We are planning people. It's natural, comes natural to us. It's hard to go through life successfully without making plans. Making plans is essential. But our plans have to be flexible because we don't know what's going to happen. Surprises come up. As the old insurance commercial used to say, life comes at you fast. I had a student who had retired from the Army. He said that he joined the Army because at that time they had a recruiting slogan that said, "Join the Army, see the world." He said, "I joined the Army to see the world, but all I saw was Fort Bragg." Sometimes our plans don't go the way we thought they would. I once worked at a camp that was attached to a conference center. And at the front desk of the conference center was a sign. The front desk closes from midnight to 6 a.m. Plan your emergencies accordingly. Yeah. Well, it's hard to plan our emergencies. We all make plans, but we have to hold our plans lightly. What do we do? How do we react when things don't go according to our plans? That's what our scripture lesson is about today. We have been having a series called Practical Acts, where we look at a practical question through the lens of a scripture from the book of Acts. And our scripture today is from chapter 28, the first 10 verses. How do we react when things don't go according to our plans? In this scripture, Paul, the apostle, had planned to go to Rome. But along the way, he finds himself shipwrecked on the island of Malta. What can we learn from Paul about how to react when things don't go according to our plans? Let's look at Acts chapter 28, verses 1 through 10. After we had reached safety, we then learned that the island was called Malta. The natives showed us unusual kindness. Since it had begun to rain and was cold, they kindled a fire and welcomed us all around it. Paul had gathered a bunch of brushwood and was putting it on the fire when a viper, driven out by the heat, fastened itself on his hand. When the natives saw the creature hanging from his hand, they said to one another, "This man must be a murderer. He has escaped from the sea, but justice has not allowed him to live." He, however, shook off the creature into the fire and suffered no harm. They were expecting him to swell up or drop dead. But after they had waited a long time and saw that nothing unusual had happened, they changed their minds and began to say that he was a god. Now, in the neighborhood of that place were lands belonging to the leading man of the island, named Publius, who received us and entertained us hospitably for 3 days. It so happened that the father of Publius lay sick in bed with fever and dysentery. Paul visited him and cured him by praying and putting his hands on him. After this happened, the rest of the people on the island who had diseases also came and were cured. They bestowed many honors on us, and when we were about to sail, they put on board all the provisions we needed. Paul had a plan. His plan was to go to the city of Rome. We first read about his plan in chapter 19 of the book of Acts. Paul decided to visit Jerusalem, and then after going to Jerusalem, he says, I will see Rome also. But things didn't go according to his plan. When he was in Jerusalem, a crowd made false accusations against him, and he was accused of a crime, falsely accused, and put into jail for 2 years. When he finally received a trial, he decided to appeal his case, which was his right as a Roman citizen, to the emperor in Rome. He had a detour, but he found another way to get to Rome. Only this time he was not going to Rome as a missionary, he was going as a prisoner. He didn't get to choose the way or the time in which he went. The officer in charge of him put him on a ship that was sailing in the middle of winter, the worst time to sail on the Mediterranean Sea. And sure enough, their ship was blown off course by a terrible storm, almost a hurricane-force storm that lasted for 2 weeks. Finally, their ship wrecked against a reef outside the island of Malta. Paul had survived the dangerous journey. He had survived the storm at sea. He even survived the shipwreck, only to go ashore, and while he was building a fire, a snake bit him on the hand. It's almost as if he was playing a game of can you top this, of things that can go wrong. What can we learn from Paul's experience about when things go wrong for us? 2 things that are very important to learn. The first one is there are things that are beyond our control. Paul was an apostle, personally chosen by Jesus to represent him to the people of the world. He was on a mission. He dedicated his life to serve God. And yet there were still things that even a dedicated spiritual person like Paul could not control. One thing that we can't control is the things that happen to us. We can plan, and we should plan. We can be cautious and think about our safety, and we should do that. That's wise and that's reasonable to do. But even so, plan all that we want to, we still can't control everything that happens to us. Paul was trying to go to Rome, but he found himself a prisoner. He was placed on a ship. He found himself in a storm. He was shipwrecked, but what did he do? We're not told exactly what he was thinking or feeling, but we see that when things went wrong, he moved on to the next thing. He pitched in and helped to build the fire that they needed in the cold of the winter. But while he was doing that, a snake bit him on the hand, and there he was, shipwrecked, cold, with a snake hanging off his hand. What do we do when things like that happen, beyond our control? Well, we can learn from Paul to just shake it off. Keep moving. Don't stop grooving, right? There are things that happen we can't control. And sometimes we just have to shake it off. The other thing we can't control is we can't control what people think about us. Look at Paul's example. When he was bitten by the snake, the people of the island thought, aha, he's a murderer. He survived the shipwreck, but justice is out to get him because he's done something terrible. They waited for him to die from the bite of the snake. And then when that didn't happen, they said, well, he must be a god. Within a short span of time, he went from being thought of as a murderer to being thought of as a god. But neither of that appears to have bothered Paul. He just kept doing what he was doing. We can't control everything that happens to us. We can't control what other people think about us. They'll think what they choose to think. So what can we control? From Paul, we learn that we can control who we trust. This scripture doesn't tell us what Paul was thinking or feeling, but thankfully, we have another scripture from his letters that give us some insight into how he responded to what happened. In his letter to the Philippians, in chapter 4, he wrote this: I have learned to be content with whatever I have. I know what it is to have little, and I know what it is to have plenty. In any and all circumstances, I have learned the secret of either being well fed or of going hungry, of having plenty and of being in need. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. When Paul's plans changed in light of things that were beyond his control, what he could control was who he trusted. He said, I've learned to be content. Contentment is something that we can learn. And the secret, he said, is in trusting Christ in all things. When unexpected things happen that weren't a part of our plan, we can learn to trust Christ in the middle of our circumstances. That even includes trusting Christ with the feelings that we have about the plans that were lost. It's not an easy thing to give up on a plan that we had our heart set on. That's a loss. That causes grief. Those feelings are real. There's nothing in this scripture that tells us we have to be robots or stoics and our feelings and our expressions never change no matter what happens. I'm sure Paul had all the feelings that you and I would have in his circumstances. And the Bible shows us how we can trust those feelings to God. The Bible is full of prayers of faithful people who, when they were overwhelmed by life circumstances, they cried out to God openly and honestly about the feelings that they were having. The book of Psalms is full of such prayers. Trusting God doesn't mean we have to hide the way we feel or hide our natural reactions when the unexpected happens. Paul could control who he trusted. And he trusted Christ, he said, in all circumstances. We can also control how we choose to respond. We can control what we do. When Paul was on the island of Malta, he didn't sit around and sulk, waiting until the next time he could continue on his way to Rome. When he learned that the father of the person he was staying with was sick, he went and he visited the sick. That's what Jesus taught his followers to do. And when he visited the man who was sick, he prayed for this man. And because Paul trusted God, God trusted Paul enough to use his prayers to heal this man and to heal other people on the island who came to Paul for help. What would it be like if God trusted our prayers enough to use our prayers to do God's work? That's a possibility. But it doesn't simply happen. It's something that we learn over the course of our relationship with God. As unexpected things happened to Paul, he used those times to grow closer in his relationship to God. While he was in jail for 2 years waiting for a trial, he continued to seek the presence of God in prayer and to grow closer to God. While he was on that ship in the middle of that storm, he continued to pray and to seek God's will and to learn how his prayers could be a part of what God was doing. When I was a pastor in Durham, there was a Methodist church close to the church where I served, and we would often have services together, and I will never forget the poster that my Methodist friend had in his study. The poster said, "Blessed are the flexible, for they will not be bent out of shape." We have to make plans, but our plans can always change. We have to be flexible. This reminds me that in the book of Acts, there is a way of describing the Christian faith that we often overlook. In the book of Acts, Christians are often called followers of the way. Followers of the way. Following Christ is a way of life. It's not called followers of the plan. Our plans can change because unexpected things happen all the time. But when those unexpected things happen, we can still follow the way of Christ. We can trust Christ in all circumstances. We can have control over what we do. We can choose to continue doing the things that Christ has taught us to do. When Lewis and Clark reached the Rocky Mountains, they had to leave their canoes behind. But they weren't canoers anyway. They were explorers. And they kept exploring until they crossed the mountains and reached the Pacific Ocean. Paul had plans, but more than any of his plans, he was a follower of the way of Christ. And he kept following the way. And he kept following Christ, who is the way, who was with him. And that's what we can learn to do as well.